back in college, I had some friends that were into some weird things. Now, not serious things, not anything like that, but there's some weird college weird things. You know, when you're in college sometimes, or if you first time you go out on your own and you begin to kind of explore different things you might like or not like, and you end up with some crazy places. Like I had one group of friends. I didn't join them in this. I still think this one's kind of weird, but they got really into SpongeBob for a while. Like I said, I didn't quite understand that one, but I had some other friends, though. These were ended up being good friends of mine. I was introduced to by my roommate freshman year, and they would get together on Monday nights, and they'd be down in one of the common areas in our dorm, and they would watch wrestling. You know, I didn't know much about it at the time, but I would go down and I'm having a good time. And I am almost disturbed. You can probably, if I remember to put this in, see a picture of one of our times when we were all together. And me, and because we would sometimes, I can't tell you the number of couches I fell over at some point because we were trying to reenact the things that we were watching on TV. But then those friends also we're also into something else, something that I would occasionally laugh at them for. I'm like, really, guys, you're like supposed to be acting like adults, but they were really big into this, and I would laugh at them, and I would give them a hard time, and eventually I thought, okay, I'm going to prove them wrong. So I went to one particular building on campus. I went to one section of that building, and I went and I found it, and that building, of course, was the library, and that section was the popular fiction section of the library. I don't know that that's what that was actually called, but that's what I remember it being in my head. And I found the book I was looking for, and I checked it out so I could read it, and that book was Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. And since that time, I have been hooked on that series. Since then, it is to this day one of my favorite book series of all time, and will continue to reread it, and then looking forward to reading it with my kids at some point. And for me, one of the more fascinating parts of the series is there's lots of great things in this series, but one of them is this relationship between the main character, Harry Potter, and one of his teachers, his professor, Severus Snape. And Snape is one of the antagonists of the series, and the first time we ever see the two of them together in the book is Harry's coming into his first potions class, and Snape begins to ask him questions that he probably is not going to know the answers to, shouldn't know the answers to, and then tosses in some other things. Snape is clearly bullying Harry in this first class. Snape is a grown adult, and Harry is an 11-year-old kid, and this is our first introduction to them. And as the books go on, we find the animosity from Snape comes from a feud that he had with Harry's father and his friends, and that Harry's dad and his friends would bully Snape many times. But we also see that Snape had been best friends with Harry's mother, that they grew up together, that they knew each other well, and that was all well and good until Snape did something really stupid and ruined the friendship and the relationship that they had with each other. Harry loathes Snape and hated it to interact with him, and thinks that he was the bad guy behind so many of the different things that were going on. And to be fair, Snape was a real jerk. And to make matters worse, almost seemingly accidentally, Snape helps finish putting pieces together that led to Harry's parents being killed. Snape is also the one who kills Harry's mentor and grandfather figure, the headmaster of his school, Albus Dumbledore, and so much that happens. But here's the crazy thing. We get to the end of the series, and this is, I should put like spoilers up here to say if you haven't read it, this is what you're going to find something out, but it's been long enough now, you should probably know. And here's the crazy thing. At the end of the series, we find out in the epilogue that Harry names one of his kids after who he calls two of the most important men in his lives, Albus for Albus Dumbledore and Severus for Severus Snape. Now, how did they make that transition through all of this? We'll come back and take a look at that here after a bit, so I want you to hold on to that. But remember, last week we started looking at God's promise to Abraham, and the thing that we pointed out was that God didn't expect Abraham to be perfect. Nor does God promise us perfection in return, meaning that our lives aren't going to be perfect. But God made a promise to Abraham that his descendants would grow and grow and grow, and that God would be there through it all. One of the other ways we see this talked about is that because God made this promise to Abraham multiple times in Genesis, because this was such a very difficult and hard thing for them to understand and wrap their heads around, because it was so different from their expectations. So God reiterates it to him in multiple occasions. And on another time he says to Abraham, they will be my people, meaning his descendants. They will be my people and I will be their God. And he's building in this relationship between the two of them, this covenant that he is making. And as part of a covenant, both sides work to give something to that relationship, to build strength in that relationship. And the people, Abraham's promise was that he would be faithful, that they would be faithful to God. And God says, and I will be there with you. Now, what does that really mean to say that God is going to be there with us? What way can we look at that helps us to understand what that means God is doing? Because I don't know about you, but sometimes I think that I don't always completely understand how that works. And so think of it like this. Think of you're out in the middle of the ocean on a rowboat, right? I don't know what you're doing out in the middle of the ocean on a rowboat, but that's where you are. I don't want to know the story. It's probably an interesting story how you got there, but that's where you are. That's something for another time to figure out how you got there, but that's where you are. So you're out in the middle of the ocean, you're on this rowboat, and the wind begins to pick up. It doesn't get really strong, but it just begins to pick up, and all you can see all around you for hundreds of miles in any direction is water. What does it feel like on that rowboat right now as the wind picks up a little bit? Kind of getting sloshed around. You're kind of having to work to kind of maintain your grip. Maybe you aren't worried about falling out, but it's getting really uncomfortable and you're just trying to stay in one seated place. You don't have a lot of time to do anything else. Now, take a look at it this direction. Imagine you are in a very similar place in the ocean, only now instead of a rowboat, you're on a cruise ship. Now, I know many of you who are watching this right now have probably been on a cruise ship, or have some idea what that's like. And so imagine as you are leaving your cabin and you're walking out to go find a lounge chair by the pool out on the pool deck, and the wind begins to pick up a little bit, not huge, but just a little bit. And you stop to maybe pick up a fresh baked chocolate chip cookie from one of the many places you can get food on board ship. And they give it to you. It's kind of wrapped up in a napkin a little bit so you can keep the chocolate from getting on your fingers. And you go and you find your nice lounge chair by the pool to go and to sit and to relax and maybe even you're going to read Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, whatever it is that's going to float your boat at that point. And you finish your cookie, you put the napkin up there, the wind is picked up just a little bit, and the worst thing that happens to you is your napkin from the cookie blows off the table and onto the ground, and you have to go pick it up and go throw it away, right? Not a lot of other concerns in that moment. God promising to be with us has that same sort of effect. That same sort of effect of giving us a stability in a choppy world. That means we can handle things that we couldn't before because we aren't trying to hold on to everything, that we have space and time to figure that out. That in our being faithful to God and Him saying that He is going to be there with us puts us in a very different place than we were before. But part of that, though, what happens is that also means, though, that there's our part of this also in being faithful to God. That means something for us. And that means that there is work for us to do, because in that relationship with God and the stability that He gives us, it means then that we have the opportunity to be different. And what we do in the rowboat is different than what we do sitting on a lounge chair by the pool. And that means that in that difference, we have to begin directly confronting one of the greatest lies of our time. And I call it a lie because for people of faith, it is a lie. But only because we find stability and strength in God's presence with us. Because we have stepped out of the boat and onto something bigger. But for the folks that are still struggling in the boat, it's not a lie for them. That is the truth that they are living, because they are holding on to what they have in that moment, and what they have, and those things that they have, they will hold on to, and they can't change because that's how they're holding on. And the lie is that we can never change, that we can never be different. That what you believed 10 years ago is what you believe now. That what you did 20 years ago is still who you are now. That what was done to you as a child is what you now get to do to others. And that list can go on and on, that we just don't change. And in fact, it's not even that we don't change, but we continue to perpetuate other things on because that is just the way that things are. And that's the way that things work. If our expectation is perfection, and if we hit perfection, then that means that things can't change. And that means that if it is bad now, it is always going to be bad, that there is no hope for anything else. But God's expectation is not one of perfection. God's expectation is covenant and relationship. And so we take a look at one of these stories of covenant and relationship that plays itself out with Joseph and with his brothers. You remember that story, the story of Joseph and his brothers? Think about that for a second. What are the things you remember from that, right? Probably a number of different things that you can think of that you can remember about that. And so I'm going to go through the short version of this story, the quick one. And that is that Abraham, God's promise to Abraham was fulfilled, and and Abraham and Sarah had a son. They named him Isaac. Isaac gets married, and he has two sons, Esau and Jacob. They fight for a while. They become estranged, but they kind of eventually get everything worked back together because they grow up and they get their stuff worked out. And then we follow Jacob's side of the family. And Jacob has 12 sons with several different women. But Jacob does the thing you aren't supposed to do as a parent, or at least this is what I've been told, and that's that he had a favorite. And it wasn't just that he had a favorite, but everyone knew who his favorite was because Jacob gave him his amazing Technicolor dream coat. Thank you for musical reference now that everyone knows exactly what we're talking about. Jacob's favorite, of course, was Joseph. Joseph, who was the oldest son of Jacob's favorite wife, but he was also son number 11 out of 12. And so Joseph is in kind of that place. His brothers don't like him because, quite frankly, Joseph also is a little snot at this point in the story. And so there's a lot of animosity that is built up between them. And so Joseph's brothers come up with this way of getting rid of Joseph. So first they think that, we're just going to kill him and that'll be fine. They say, well, we can't kill him. So they sell him into slavery instead. And then they go back to their father and say that he's been killed. And so they go on with their life thinking that they're going to be through with Joseph forever. And Joseph, meanwhile, goes into slavery. He finds himself as a slave in Potiphar's house, and he is very good in that role. He's a very good manager and steward and all of that, except that when something happens, he does the right and the honorable thing, and that ultimately gets him thrown in prison. But while he's in prison, he does this thing where he interprets dreams. And he interprets dreams for several folks, but one of them is very important because it's, Pharaoh. You don't get much more important than that in Egypt at the time. And Pharaoh hears Joseph's interpretation and sees and begins to learn that Joseph is a man of great wisdom, and so makes Joseph the second most powerful man in all of Egypt by putting him in charge of preparing for this drought that they expected to come because of these dreams. And the drought comes and it is bad, but Egypt is prepared because of Joseph. And in fact, they're really kind of thriving in this economic downturn that they're going through, to the point that when they begin to run out of food, Jacob sends his sons to go buy grain from Egypt. Right? You can see where this is going now. And so they go and they do this, and when they come in, Joseph recognizes them immediately, but they have no idea who he is because they are not expecting to see him there. And so there's a whole lot of stuff that happens in the middle of this, but ultimately Joseph tells them who he is, and they begin the process of coming back together. But Joseph's brothers are worried, because for as much time as they have spent under God's promise, this was still something that even a couple of generations later was still very confusing and hard to make sense of. And so they were worried about Joseph's reaction. That if Joseph, who by their understanding hadn't been living under this promise, was going to be to them as they were to him, and he was going to still be that same snotty boy that he was back in the day, they were worried about what's going to happen. So they thought that they're going to get ahead of this. And so we're in chapter 50, verse 18, and they come up to Joseph and they tell him, we are your slaves. We're going to get ahead of this and hopefully maybe be okay through all the things that are happening. But Joseph, in verses 19 to 21, shows that he also gets God's promise. And he says this, or it says this in verses 19 to 21. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid, am I God? You planned something bad for me, but God produced something good from it in order to save the lives of many people, just as he's doing today. Now don't be afraid. I will take care of you and your children." And then literally, because we're at the end of the book of Genesis, they live happily ever after, the end. That's how Joseph's story ends. And the key to this story is that everyone involved learns the lie. Learn it for what it is. That they are in a relationship with one another, and relationships are not perfect. But that's good. That's good that relationships aren't perfect, because that means that none of them are idiot teenagers anymore. And that is always a good thing, not to be an idiot teenager. And that they have changed, they've become different, and God has given them the space they needed to become that different person. And God used what happened to make something good come out of it. Now, that's not to say, because another one of the lies that gets told is that bad things happen so that good things can happen. It's like, no, that's not how that works. Bad things will always happen. That's just the nature of the life that we live. But it doesn't mean that God can't also find a good purpose for them. That means that when bad things happen, we can still feel bad. They can still hurt. They can still be a struggle. But it also means that there can be something good that comes from that. And it means that Joseph's brothers could grow up, that they could recognize the things that they had done and how bad they were, and that when given the opportunity, they could choose differently, and they did because they were given the opportunity. Look back through their story and see what happens with Benjamin in the middle of all of this. And it meant that Joseph could overcome this also. And that when we see them come together as a family again and find new strength together, that family begins to grow more and more and more. And God's promise is still at work. Now go back to the Harry Potter story that we started all of this out with, and put their relationship into the same context. These were two people that had a deep and abiding dislike and hatred of one another, and both of them for what they felt like were good reasons. And yet, while he was far from perfect, we find out that Snape had repented and was a different guy and had been working incredibly hard for the good guys throughout the story. And he had worked to protect Harry, and Harry did the hardest thing that he had to do in his relationship with Snape, that he believed him. And while the good part of their relationship only lasts for an instant, that instant was key because it changed both of them. It wasn't perfect, but it was a relationship. And the great lie was proved again because they could be different. They could become different than they were before. The lie that we have to be the same today that we were before isn't part of the promise that God made to us through Abraham. The lie that we should expect others to be the same as they were before and never change isn't part of the promise that God made to us. That we're told consistency is always best doesn't fit in the covenant that God made with Abraham. We are in relationship with each other and with people that maybe we don't even know yet. And for that to work, to fully experience the promise that God made, we have to be different over time. We have to change and know that others are going to do the same. And when we can do that, we will live in unexpected places and we will do unexpected things. But then we can change the world. Or if changing the world feels a little bit too big, we can know that we can change our part in this world. And that will make all the difference. Go out from here and live in God's promise and be in relationship with God and know that He is with you. Be in relationship with those others that are around you and know that they are or can be a part of God's promise and help them to come and find that stability in that place. Most importantly, go and do all of this in Jesus' name. Amen. Now I invite you to take a few moments and look at the reflection questions that are there and to reflect on where we've been. And when you're ready, join in singing our next song.